Choice is often imagined as the starting point of history, as if movement begins when intention appears. But on the European plain, choice arrives late, long after terrain has already closed, long after distance, rivers, and borders have narrowed motion into corridors that repeat themselves. What looks like decision is often recognition. What feels like freedom appears only once the map has already finished its work. This essay traces a structure that reshaped Germany before strategy could intervene. Not a sequence of wars, nor the ambitions of leaders, but a continental geometry that makes escape appear possible only after it has already been denied. By the end, the listener should see encirclement not as an outcome of action, but as a condition that existed first and waited. This structure matters because it recurs, not as memory, but as pressure, not as ideology, but as geography quietly insisting on repetition. Nothing here announces itself as destiny. It accumulates. And once it becomes visible, it is already too late to leave. Germany sits without natural enclosure, no ocean boundary to the north wide enough to isolate, no mountain barrier high enough to seal. To the west, lowlands slope gently toward France and the Low Countries. To the east, plains open toward Poland and beyond, unbroken and exposed. Rivers exist, the Rhine, the Elbe, the Oder, but none form a closed perimeter. They channel movement, they do not stop it. The North German plain stretches uninterrupted from the English Channel deep into Eastern Europe. It is flat, navigable, and historically crowded. Armies, trade, and ideas move easily across it. Distance here is measured not in barriers, but in time. The farther one travels, the more borders accumulate rather than disappear. Germany's central position compresses scale. France lies close to the west. Russia, later the Soviet Union, lies vast to the east. Scandinavia presses from the north through maritime routes. The Balkans and the Alps define the south but do not fully insulate it. This is a space defined less by edges than by intersections. Resources reflect this exposure. Coal deposits concentrate in the Ruhr and Saar, near borders rather than deep interior. Iron ore historically required import or extended supply lines. Food production depends on access to surrounding plains and trade routes. The major rivers run outward, linking Germany to neighbors rather than enclosing it within itself. Trade routes cross rather than terminate. Rail lines converge. Roads radiate. Ports like Hamburg and Bremen open northward but remain vulnerable to blockade. Access exists, but security does not accumulate with it. Movement is possible in all directions, which means control is not. This is the terrain before intent. Nothing here demands aggression, but nothing here allows withdrawal into isolation either. Pressure exists simply by being surrounded by openness. Over time, this openness begins to narrow choice, not suddenly, quietly. Each neighbor represents not an enemy but a variable. Each border adds uncertainty. Security in such a space cannot be passive. It must be maintained across multiple directions simultaneously. To the west, France seeks depth after repeated invasions. Its strategy is containment, not conquest. Fortifications like the Maginot Line reflect fear of exposure rather than ambition. But fortification itself alters the structure. It pushes movement northward, toward Belgium and the Low Countries, turning neutral space into transit space. To the east, the vastness of Russia creates a different pressure. Distance there is both protection and threat. It absorbs invasion, but it also denies quick resolution. Any movement eastward lengthens supply lines and delays feedback. Retreat becomes slow. Engagement becomes sticky. Between these poles, Germany experiences compression. Any effort to secure one side increases vulnerability on the other. Resources committed west cannot be committed east. Rail capacity is finite. Mobilization reveals scarcity rather than strength. Silence enters here, not as pause, but as logistics. Trains must choose routes. Coal must fuel steel or transport, not both equally. Grain imports depend on maritime access that can be cut. None of these decisions feel ideological. They feel technical, but each one narrows flexibility. Over decades, alliances form not from preference, but from adjacency. Germany's neighbors find coherence in proximity. Coordination emerges because geography encourages it. Encirclement does not require conspiracy. It requires alignment of interests that already exist. Attempts to escape this pattern often intensify it. Expansion eastward promises resources and depth, but creates longer borders to defend. Influence in Central Europe promises buffer zones, but also adds obligations. Every extension increases the perimeter faster than capacity. The structure repeats regardless of regime. Empires, republics, and states inherit the same map. Infrastructure laid for trade becomes infrastructure for movement. Railways built to integrate markets become corridors. Armies must defend. What once promised connection becomes exposure. Another shift. Scale widens. Maritime access. Germany's ports face the North Sea and Baltic, both constrained. The British Isles command the Atlantic approaches. Control of sea lanes determines resource flow. Naval competition emerges not from ambition, but from dependency. Import reliance creates vulnerability. Vulnerability invites contest. Blockade is not an act of war first. It is a function of geography. Narrow exits invite closure. Once closed, alternatives shrink rapidly. Overland routes cannot compensate at scale. Industrial systems depend on throughput, not stockpiles. Recognition arrives unevenly. Planners see fragments, a rail bottleneck here, a fuel shortage there. But structure does not announce itself as a single problem. It appears as recurring inconvenience, as delay, as constraint that cannot be fully solved, only managed. At this point, choice begins to appear, not between freedom and safety, but between pressures. Move outward to relieve compression or remain static and absorb it. Neither option removes the underlying condition. One accelerates exposure. The other concedes initiative. The map does not dictate timing, but it does dictate direction. Movement that seeks relief tends to follow the same corridors again and again. North through the low countries, east across the plains, south constrained by mountains, west limited by fortification and sea power. Pause here. A quieter layer. Demographics. Population density increases industrial demand. Urban centers require food and fuel. Imports rise. Trade dependence deepens. Each year of growth tightens coupling with external systems. Autarky appears as an idea, but structure resists it. Raw materials are unevenly distributed. Synthetic substitutes require energy. Energy requires access. Circular dependence forms. The system becomes brittle not because it is weak, but because it is tightly optimized. Encirclement, then, is not lines on a map. It is feedback delay. It is the inability to test options without committing fully. It is the absence of partial moves. In a compressed system, small actions propagate widely. Recognition sharpens. The structure becomes visible. But visibility does not equal escape. To withdraw requires time and space. Both are limited. To remain requires acceptance of dependency. Dependency feels unstable. The fracture is not collapse. It is awareness without exit. Planners understand the trap but cannot widen it without worsening exposure. Neutrality does not dissolve borders. Trade does not erase choke points. Geography does not renegotiate. A single unresolved question hangs here. Can a central power in an open plain ever reduce pressure without transferring it elsewhere? The structure offers no answer, only repetition. The final movement does not close, it suspends. Germany remains where it has always been, central, open, intersected. Pressure does not vanish when action stops. It waits. Rivers continue to flow outward. Rail lines continue to converge. Borders remain close. Encirclement, in this sense, is not imposed. It is inherited. And inheritance does not ask consent. it only accumulates consequence. If you found meaning here, you're welcome to explore more on Timeless Questions, where we examine history not for answers, but for understanding.